Well, here in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells the story about a wealthy man who was preparing to go on a long journey. Before he departed, he called 3 of his servants into his office and gave them each a substantial sum of money to take care of while he was gone. To the first man, he gave 5 talents. Now, a talent in our day and age refers to a skill or ability that someone has. But in Jesus' day, a talent was a measurement, in this case, of gold or silver, equal to over 100 pounds. That's almost as much as some of you in this audience weigh, or maybe more than some of you. It's hard for us to imagine that amount of money because most of us have never seen that much gold or silver in our lives. In biblical times, it would have taken the average laborer 15 years to earn a talent's worth of gold. In today's currency, that would translate to over $500,000. So the first servant was essentially entrusted with $2.5 million. The second servant was entrusted with $1 million. And the third servant was entrusted with $500,000. And then the wealthy man left for his journey without providing any instructions to the servants as to what they were to do with his property and his money while he was gone. But each of the servants thought that they knew the master pretty well, and so they immediately began to make decisions based upon what they thought that he would want them to do. The first man took his 500 pounds of gold and went off and began trading with it. By the time the master returned, that first servant had doubled his master's money from $2.5 million to $5 million in our currency. The second servant took his $1 million worth of gold and went out and began doing the same. And when the master came back, the servant gave his master $2 million worth of gold. Now, obviously the master was extremely pleased with these first 2 servants, and he entrusted them with even more of his property and possessions to manage, saying, "Enter into the joy of your Lord." But the third servant, that third servant, having observed the master was a harsh man who was cold and calculating and seemed to care little for others, that third servant was afraid. Perhaps he felt that the responsibility given to him was too great, that he wasn't ready for such a responsibility. Perhaps he was afraid of messing up, of making a mistake or losing his master's wealth. And so he took the 100 pounds of gold with which he had been entrusted, he dug a hole in the ground, and he buried the money for safekeeping until his master returned. Sure enough, when the master returned from his journey, the man dug up the gold and brought it to his master, explaining that he knew that his master was a harsh man and that he had buried it for safekeeping because he was afraid. Now, most likely, this third servant expected the master to breathe a huge sigh of relief that his gold was returned to him safely. Perhaps he expected a pat on the back because he had not lost any of his master's money. But instead, the master was furious. He questioned the man as to why he hadn't at least deposited the money into a bank where it would have gained at least a little bit of interest. Even with today's extremely low savings account rates, $500,000 would at least earn a few $1,000s in interest. The master was not, in fact, pleased that the man had simply buried his money, and rather than entrusting him with more responsibilities, he took the gold away from him and gave it to the first servant who had proven his ability to multiply his master's wealth. Now, like our gospel lesson from last week, we must be careful not to read too much into this story. We must fight against the temptation to pick apart the narrative and try to correlate every single detail from the parable to someone or something in our day and age. Most of the parables that Jesus told were intended to evoke a particular emotion or feeling, or to illustrate a single point. In the parable that we saw last week in our gospel lesson, the intention of the parable was to illustrate what it's like to await the fulfillment of God's kingdom, which will ultimately take place when Christ returns. We saw in that parable that, like the bridesmaids, we must be watchful. Keep praying, keep alert, and keep working for God's kingdom, since we do not know when Christ will return. Now, Jesus prefaces this parable with the words, "It is as if." The "it" here most likely refers to the kingdom of heaven and how we are to live in the meantime as we await the day when Christ returns and the kingdom comes in its fullness. And so I want to share a few points of connection and a few points in which I think maybe our life differs from the parable. First of all, the similarity. Like the servants who were entrusted with their master's money but did not actually own it themselves, so too, everything that we have in our possession ultimately belongs to God. Now, I know some of us may say, but I have worked hard for everything that I have. And that may be true. But it was God who gave us the will and the means to work. It was God who gave us the skills and the abilities, the initiative, the drive, the opportunity to earn what we have. And so ultimately, everything that we have belongs to God, not to us. As it says in 1 Timothy 6, verse 7, we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. One of the questions this parable raises for us, then, is what do we do with the possessions that we've been entrusted with while we are here on this earth? Does God expect us to multiply the wealth and the resources that we've been given, like the first two servants in this story? But you see, in contrast to the master in Jesus' story, who was a harsh man who reaped where he did not plant and harvested where he did not sow, our master is kind and loving and generous. Our master, God, cares for those who are oppressed and the marginalized and downtrodden. God hears the cries of the needy and the poor. And so as stewards who have been entrusted with God's resources, we should use the wealth that we've been entrusted with in accordance with God's kingdom values. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, taught 3 simple rules in relation to money. Number 1, earn all you can. Number 2, save all you can. And number 3, give all you can. The story goes that when Wesley was a fellow at Oxford University in the early 1700s, he encountered a chambermaid on a cold, wintry day. He noticed that the woman was wearing only a thin linen gown for protection against the bitter cold. John Wesley was moved with compassion, and he reached into his pocket to give her some money so that she could go out and buy herself a coat. But he realized that he had very little money in his pocket, having recently spent a large sum of money to buy pictures to adorn the walls of his rooms. It struck Wesley that the Lord was probably not pleased with how he had spent his money. He asked himself, "Will thy master say, 'Well done, good and faithful servant'? Thou hast adorned thy walls with the money that might have screened this poor creature from the cold." And John Wesley, who was always quite intense, went on to say, "O justice, O mercy, are not these pictures on my walls the blood of this poor maid?" After this experience, Wesley committed himself to living as frugally as possible so that he could give away as much money as he could. As his income increased over the years, his standard of living did not. He continued to live essentially on a college grad student stipend and gave away all of his excess money. When he passed, John Wesley had no wealth to speak of, only a few coins in his pockets and drawers, and as a true scholar, he had a substantial collection of books on his shelves. But in contrast to many religious people of his day who railed against money, John Wesley pointed out that it is the love of money that is the root of all evil, not money itself. According to John Wesley, money is an excellent gift from God, answering the noblest ends. In the hands of God's children, it is food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, raiment for the naked, a defense for the oppressed, a means of health to the sick, and of ease to them that are in pain. What a beautiful sentiment. Now, of course, Jesus' parable here does not only apply to the way that we use our worldly possessions. It also applies to the ways in which we use everything that we've been entrusted with. Our gifts, our talents, our skills, our abilities, our relationships, and even the people who are under our care. Like the servants in this story, we are simply stewards of all that we have. None of it belongs to us. And like the stewards, we should use what has been entrusted to us in accordance with our master's desires. And so rather than hiding away or burying the resources, skills, and talents with which we have been entrusted, we should use them creatively and lavishly to further and advance God's purposes in this world. If you have excess money or financial resources, invest it in kingdom purposes. If you have excess time, see how you can use it to bless others. If you've been given special skills or abilities, which we all have, use them to share and proclaim God's love with those around you. Unlike the third servant, we do not have to live our lives in fear of messing up or slipping up. For we know that our God is a loving and compassionate God, ready to forgive us and ready to heal, ready to welcome us back when we go astray. And so let us live creatively. Let's live abundantly, earning all we can, growing and developing in our skills and abilities and talents, and even our wealth and resources, saving all we can, and giving away all that we can. Let us love freely, even as God has loved us. Let us forgive, even as we have been forgiven. And let's continue to work for God's kingdom until Christ returns, when we can truly enter into the joy that God has prepared for us.